My name is Dan Sheffield. I'm the director of the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies here at Princeton, and it's my pleasure to be welcoming you all here for what is sure to be an absolutely memorable and delightful talk by someone who really needs no introduction at all, a giant of our field, who is Professor Nasrin Rahimieh. Professor Rahimieh is the Howard Baskerville Professor of the Humanities in the Department of Comparative Literature at, as I was just saying, a university that has become the center of Iranian studies, Del Iran Shah, that is the University of California at Irvine, a university which over my career as a scholar of Iranian studies has established itself as one of the main centers for the study of Iran and the Iranian and Persianate worlds. Professor Rahimieh has done enormous service for our field, that is the field of Iranian studies. Many of you will recognize her name because it appears at the top of the masthead of the flagship journal of our field, the Journal of Iranian Studies, for which Dr. Rahimieh is the long-serving and probably long-suffering editor of that journal. These kinds of forms of academic service are often thankless tasks, but they do an enormous service to our field in ensuring that good scholarship reaches the largest possible audiences. And there's none who has done a more graceful and a more important job in shepherding our field than Professor Rahimieh. So we're really grateful to have her. In addition to all of the service which she has done for the field, she's also been roped apparently into further university service where she has been made Associate Dean for Personnel in the Division of the Humanities at UCI. So all of those junior faculty members who have recently had to go through the tenure process or promotion process have Professor Rahimieh to thank for shepherding their files through. But beyond all of the immense service which she has performed for the field of Iranian studies and for the humanities more broadly over her long career, Professor Rahimieh is most famous for her own work. She is probably the leading scholar in North America for the study of modern Persian literature. Her research interests span a wide variety of topics, from intercultural encounters between Iran and the West, modern Persian literature, the literature of exile and displacement, women's writing, post-revolutionary Iranian cinema, and many other fields. She's the author of a number of books and the editor of a number of edited volumes. Just reading from her webpage here, these books include Iranian Culture, Representation, and Identity from Routledge 2016, Missing Persians, Discovering Voices in Iranian Cultural Heritage, Oriental Responses to the West, Comparative Essays and Select Writers from the Muslim World, a recent volume on Farrokhzad, and a wide variety of other topics. So I encourage anyone after today's talk who's not familiar with one or another aspect of Professor Rahimieh's broad oeuvre of writing to please look her up online and go read some of these wonderful works. Today's talk has a very important, wonderful title, which we sent to our caterer. What should I make for lunch? I'm not sure how inspired by the topic of the talk or the sandwiches that you're now eating, have a direct relationship with Belqeys Soleimani, but what a wonderful title for a lunch talk. We're going to be hearing about the poet Belqeys Soleimani on being pre-modern in post-revolutionary Iran. As someone who is a pre-modernist himself, who's charged with running a contemporary Iran center, this problem of being pre-modern in the post-revolutionary period is something that's very much dear to my heart. So with all of you, I look forward to this talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rahimieh to deliver her talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Is everything clear? Can you hear me well? Thank you. Thank you very much for that most generous and kind welcome. I don't know about being a giant in the field. I feel very small right now. And I have to say, I'm a little short too in stature. So we were just talking about how people appear on Zoom. I want to thank the center. I want to also applaud the work that all the wonderful postdoctoral scholars are doing. I have known a number of the postdoctoral scholars here and had the pleasure of getting to know their work. Keep up this wonderful work. It's great. I want to also thank you for allowing me to cancel the original talk in April, because I had to have 2 spinal surgeries, and I thought, I could barely walk. So I am very delighted to be here, to have somehow recovered from these 2 difficult surgeries, and for you to accommodate me, my schedule, and making it possible for me to be here today. So I will stop a little bit in between and add some material. It's mostly a prepared talk, but I also don't want to take too much of your time, because I really have struggled with this writer, with parsing through her work. So I welcome your thoughts, your contributions, and you're helping me struggle with this writer who's been a bit of a puzzle to me. So Belqeys Soleimani is a prolific contemporary writer who, having begun writing fiction only in her late 30s, she was almost 40, has published over a dozen novels, as well as collections of short stories and dastanak, what we can call flash fiction. Set in villages or in Tehran in the wake of the 1979 revolution, her fiction explores a wide range of issues, such as what you can classify as Defaa Muqaddas, for instance, the sacred defense, the anguish suffered by a young woman awaiting the return of a soldier chosen for her as her future husband, returning from the Iran-Iraq war, or a political dissident's escape from arrest by hiding in a stable in a village. I think it's the first work that I know that really talks about the experience of Mujahideen Khalq in the period of the arrests and the executions, the mass executions. Or, among other topics she discusses in her works, or kinds of characters she has, is a widowed or divorced women coping with socioeconomic and cultural constraints, as you can imagine, gender constraints. A unique feature of her fiction is its focus on the daily and lives of ordinary individuals. As she indicates in an interview, her writing eschews larger-than-life characters and momentous events. I quote from her, she says, "The era of heroes has passed." And, I quote, "History and major events have been replaced by ordinary lives." Now, in a collection of essays entitled "Nam Kuchek Man Belqeys, Yaddashthay Parakande," my first name is Belqeys, scattered jottings, I call it, Soleimani turns to writing about her own life experiences, ranging from childhood to early education, attending university in Tehran, and then becoming a writer. In a key essay, she states that as a writer, she lacks financial independence and that her writing is entangled with domestic responsibilities. Contrasting these conditions, albeit superficially, with what Virginia Woolf considers fundamental to women's ability to write, i.e., a woman, I'm quoting from Virginia Woolf, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction, end of quote. Now, Soleimani just does this superficial contrast, and then she declares, perhaps with a touch of irony, "Man zani pisha modernam," I am a pre-modern woman. To this disjuncture, oh, please come in their seats. To this disjuncture between being pre-modern, in post-revolution 21st century Iran, she later adds a critique of Iranian women writers for imitating their male counterparts and lacking the courage to challenge the male-dominated literary discourse. This statement is particularly puzzling as Soleimani's own fiction, as I read it and interpret it, calls into question the prevalent long-lasting cultural ideals of self-sacrificing wives and mothers. As I demonstrate in a different piece, Soleimani's female protagonists are far from compliant subjects and are quite adept at working through the sinews of patriarchal power. So, intrigued by Soleimani's apparent contradictory position vis-a-vis women's writing, I wanted to study her personal essays to map out the connections between her admiration for the 1979 revolution, her ironic self-portrait as a pre-modern woman, and her critical views on contemporary women's fiction. Now, as someone who could be classified as a mustaz'af, how do you translate that? From the oppressed classes in the parlance of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini referred to mustaz'afin. Soleimani welcomed the revolution. Of course, she was only 15 at the time, and saw herself as one of its beneficiaries, and I'll explain that. But she's more ambivalent, far more ambivalent about the afterlife of a revolution from whose promises of equality and justice women were excluded. I argue that in the very process of writing about her life, Soleimani is confronted with contradictions between the aspirations and outcomes of the revolution, which deeply impact her positionality as a woman writer, and in turn, shape her views on contemporary Iranian women's writing. Now, as I mentioned, Soleimani was 15 at the time of the revolution and lived in very humble circumstances in a small village in Kerman. Really far away. In her childhood and youth, she became keenly aware of social inequalities she and the underprivileged classes experienced, leading her to embrace the revolutionary movement with youthful zeal. The revolution and the subsequent Islamist refashioning of institutions made it possible for Soleimani to study philosophy, even though that was not her preferred subject, at the University of Tehran. Her family, who before the revolution would have been concerned about their daughter's exposure to excesses of westernization in Tehran, did not object to her moving to Tehran alone. Soleimani herself saw this move as an exciting opportunity to join a pivotal site of the revolutionary movement she had admired from a distance. But by the time she had arrived at the University of Tehran, a new regime, fearful of opposition, had prohibited protests and imposed strict modes of surveillance. The reality that met Soleimani did not match her idealized image, but it afforded her opportunities to learn about life in an urban setting. It was the first time she had left her village. Almost the first time. So in my analysis of Name Kuchek Man Belqeys, this collection, I want to focus just briefly on some of the formal aspects of the collection of essays before I delve into her early awareness of social inequality that informed her support for the revolution. And then I will focus on her work as a writer and specifically her very critical account of contemporary Iranian women's writing. Name Kuchek Man Belqeys is composed of 25 essays, and some of them are really short, all of them previously published in various journals in Iran. This collection doesn't offer a narrative, a linear life history, nor does it encompass all aspects of Soleimani's life. In fact, she barely talks about her husband. She barely mentions his name, when they got married, but she seems to adhere to cultural taboos predating the revolution against public dissemination of information about one's family. Farzaneh Milani has written about this, so I will leave that aside for now. In an interview, Soleimani offers the example of her siblings' reaction to reading the manuscript of this very book, Nam Kuchik Man Belqeys, to validate the need for self-censorship. This is one of her very puzzling statements. So I'm going to quote from her, the interview. After reading the manuscript, my brothers and sisters said, I quote, "This is our collective history, and you have no right to turn it into a commodity for sale. We don't want everyone to know about our mother," end of quote. This, too, is part of our collective culture. This is Soleimani saying, this, too, is part of our collective culture. I acknowledge that they were right. In other words, she's acknowledging that her siblings were right. As a result, parts of the book were eliminated. Material about family members was removed, as were political issues, particularly dating from the 1980s. My family and I excised them. Writing about the self is not easy at all. Miss Yavari, our own Hura Yavari, was correct to point out that in Iran, we don't have anything resembling an autobiography, end of quote. Now, it's interesting to note that here Soleimani describes the censoring process as a collective enterprise in which the author herself is a contributor. This justification of self-censorship explains some of the lacunae in Soleimani's narrative and its distinction from autobiographical writing, whose absence in Persian letters she seems almost relieved to affirm. As I hope to demonstrate, her readiness to endorse this kind of circumspection is at odds with her critique of women writers' failure to transcend the dominant male-centered literary norms and discourses. The reader familiar with Soleimani's views on life writing will be struck by the invocation of her first name in the title of the collection and the eponymous chapter, Nam Kuchik Man Belqeys. The use of the first name, to me, at least from the outside, suggests the desire for familiarity and a degree of intimacy. And I would say that in reading this collection, I found that palpable primarily in her descriptions of a childhood balanced between farm work, carpet weaving, and time spent in close quarters with her parents and 8 siblings in one room. She describes that they had 3 rooms in their house, well, we call it house. The doors all open to a courtyard, and 2 rooms were used for storage, for hay, for, whatever, the other for storage. And there was 1 room in which all 10 of them slept, and that was the only room in which, their own living space. And occasionally, she says, they had to have livestock, sickly or newborn lamb, something, also sharing that room. But coming back to her first name, it also serves as a vehicle for disclosing early lessons in the relationship between first names and social standing. She was in high school when she realized that first names were indicators of social class. She noticed that female offspring of families of higher social standing, this is still in the village, were less likely to have religious names. She notes, for instance, that Jale, Gila, Shole, Parveen, Nahid, and Furugh were customary names for daughters of small landowning families. This awareness made Soleimani dislike her first name, leading her to introduce herself already in school by her family name. Ironically, years later, when she entered the University of Tehran, she ran into even more problems with her name. She encountered instructors, professors who struggled to correctly pronounce her first name, Belqeys. This is, to me, particularly surprising because in the Islamic tradition, Belqeys is the name of the Queen of Sheba, right? One of my grandmothers was Belqeys. Perhaps the cultural revolution to which by then the Iranian universities had been subjected had not yet fully indoctrinated the professoriate. I can only speculate. Along with becoming aware of the class valence of first names, Soleimani's schooling introduces her to the influence of power, or the presence of injustice and influence of power on the course of justice. When she describes, for instance, one of her first schools that she went to, let's call it her elementary school, the students did everything. There was nominally a teacher, but that teacher asked the students to clean the rooms, clean the restrooms, wash his dishes, and also go out there and collect fodder for his sheep. And one time, as they ran into the fields, the guard, somebody guarding the fields, came after them and hit them, hit Soleimani on the ankles. And she remembered that searing pain. And she was so angry that it was the teacher that had asked them to do this. But she takes it out on the sheep. And she said, the sheep should have been punished because we were out there to get food for them. Now, she relates another anecdote about a well-to-do landowner whose daughter was in Soleimani's class, and this landowner drops by the school for an inspection. Soleimani notes that these types of inspections, while distinct from those carried out by the Ministry of Education, made both teachers and students very apprehensive. On the occasion described by Soleimani, the visiting landowner comes into the classroom, asks his own daughter a question that's related to the subject they've studied, and she bombs. When his daughter fails to answer correctly, the teacher invites Soleimani to demonstrate that, look, I've really taught them properly, so would you please answer? And she answers correctly. Faced with this proof that his own daughter had not really paid attention to her schooling, the father, the landowner, demands that his daughter be punished, putting, of course, the school teacher in a very difficult position. The reluctant teacher comes up with a face-saving measure of punishing the entire class by giving them a thrashing on the palms of their hands. Soleimani, who had shown her command of the material, thinks to herself at this moment, this is not fair. It's not just. Begrudging a punishment she does not deserve and sees as a sign of the teacher's capitulation to the powerful landowner. She writes that from then on, the word justice took hold of her imagination and became part of her character. This early experience makes Soleimani receptive to the echoes of the revolutionary movement and the demands for social justice she learns about from an older brother. Despite having earned the highest grades in his school, in his high school, that is the brother, which should have paved the way for him to enter university, he decides to attend a teacher training college because it does not tax the family's limited resources. Nonetheless, This brother's high school principal rails against the injustice of a system that does not provide a talented student with sufficient support to pursue a university education. The principal's criticism and, of course, the brother's own responses to the situation exposed Soleimani to the growing opposition to the Shah's rule. Interestingly, Soleimani's own parents remain loyal to the monarchy. Soleimani's mother, I quote, single-handedly defends the regime. Her parents both cite the improvements to their material conditions they have witnessed during the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah. For example, during Soleimani's childhood, the family did not have electricity or running water, the village didn't, I should say. But long before the revolution, they acquired electricity, purchased a refrigerator, a gas range, and eventually even a television set. During the protests, Soleimani's mother clings to hope for a reconciliation between the Shah and Ayatollah Khomeini. As a visual representation of her desire, she hangs a photograph of the Ayatollah next to a portrait of the Shah. And she says, Soleimani says, I quote, she's confident that away from the public hue and cry, they will eventually make peace. Is it imaginable that the righteous descendant of the prophet would consent to making the king of the country a dispossessed wanderer? The differing perspectives of the older and the younger generations within Soleimani's own family are not unlike the tensions during the revolution produced in so many families. I certainly witnessed that in my family. Soleimani's brother plays an important role in her life. He introduces her to books and ideas fueling the protests. She reads, for instance, for the first time, Samad Behrangi's children's story, Mahi Siyah Kuchulu, The Little Blackfish, considered as a political allegory, and of course the works of Ali Shariati, whose charismatic speeches mobilized many against the monarchy. After the success of the revolution, Soleimani focuses more intensely on Shariati's ideas. When cassette tapes of Shariati's speeches at the Hosseini Ershad arrive in her village, she borrows her sister's tape recorder, which they use for carpet weaving, the songs for carpet weaving. She borrows it to become immersed in Shariati's Amal-e Enqilabi, revolutionary action. She writes that, I quote, Shariati's model instilled in me the courage to live and to resist. One could mourn Ali, Fatimeh, Zainab, Hussein, etc., as I did, but they prepared me to hold my head high and following their lead to state who I was and what I wanted, end of quote. Prompted by her brother, Soleimani also reads the Quran and Nahjul Balaghe, the collection of sayings attributed to Ali, the Prophet's cousin, son-in-law, and the fourth Caliph, and the first Shia Imam. This immersion leads her to a new stage of becoming. I quote from her, now I was religious, but a forward-looking believer. At school, my essays astonished teachers and pupils. The combative tone of my prose, infused with a quest for justice, astonished teachers and pupils. Disturbed my classmates' sleep and garnered me top grades. However, when she was emboldened to defend some villagers and farmers against the landowners, her parents told her, hey, remember, you are a zaifeh. You know what that is? That is, you are a woman. The term traditionally referred to meaning that women are the weaker sex. At the time, those parental warnings and reminders of a woman's position in society had little effect on Soleimani's conviction. But her passion for Shariati's teachings endures until the mid-1980s, when she begins to have doubts, though she doesn't tell us what the doubts were about. And apparently those doubts also extend to Shariati's teachings. She relates a dream, I love this dream, in which Shariati is present at an exhibition of his works. Soleimani spots Shariati incongruously peeling an apple while speaking to me and others about his works. In the dream, Soleimani finds herself not paying attention to Shariati's words. Instead, this is what she thinks to herself. She says, when he has finished peeling the apple, surely he will slice it and give me one slice. To her surprise, when he has peeled the apple, Shariati offers her the entire apple, telling her, I quote, "You expected me to slice it for you. You expected me to slice it for you? I take the apple and I'm awakened, suffused with joy," end of quote. Now, here's Soleimani's own very imaginative, empowering interpretation of the dream. I quote, "The doctor," meaning Dr. Shariati, "had paved the way for me. He's not slicing the apple, but merely peeling it tells me that I have to do the rest." And no wonder that this very dream marked the beginning of my leave-taking from my mentor and intellectual father. Gradually, I parted ways with him and said goodbye to ideology. Now, it's really interesting when she says, "I said goodbye to ideology," like everything else in this collection. We don't know what that means. It would have been great if she had explained that a little bit. But in other places, she talks about her readings and the influences coming from feminist thought, and one of these I found particularly interesting. For instance, she says that she was, of course, especially during the revolution, quite taken with the idea of heroism. But she writes, "Later I learned that feminists consider heroic life to be essentially male-centered, similar to concepts of sacrifice, discipline, and distinction. Reassessing those years, I concluded that at those moments," and I'm translating very closely because this is the way she inches towards what she says, "at those moments, I gravitated toward wanting to be a man." What is fascinating about Soleimani's dream is that in it, Shariati, the revolutionary, is seen engaged in what would have been conceived traditionally as women's work and responsibility to offer hospitality to guests. In her dream, the roles are reversed, such that it is Soleimani who waits to be offered the slice of the apple, implying that her intellectual father is giving her permission to think beyond the constraints of gender roles. So that's one interpretation. Now, as she says goodbye to ideology and Shariati, though she says that she continued to admire Shariati, and she always had a portrait of Shariati wherever she lived, she looks for other role models. She turns, for instance, to Azam Taleghani, who founded the Jamiye Zanan Musalman, Society for Muslim Women, and she also served in the Iranian parliament. But she looks for more ardent revolutionaries. She turns, for instance, to Jamila Boupasha, a member of the Algerian National Liberation Front, who was tortured and raped by the French colonial forces during the Algerian War of Independence. But Soleimani's image of this Algerian revolutionary woman alters somehow as a result of an anecdote that one of her professors tells her about an Iranian delegation that goes to meet Jamila Bupasha, at her home. To the delegation's surprise, instead of the fearless fighter, they are greeted by, I quote, a housewife, surrounded by a bevy of grubby children. The Iranians, Soleimani writes, had wanted to see her physical and emotional scars as proof of her heroic past. Instead, they discovered that, I quote, she looked nothing like a heroic woman. Of course, she doesn't question what a heroic woman should look like. Where would we see those scars? Never mind. And so after, as if sharing once she says this, as if sharing the delegation's disappointment in who Bupasha has become, Soleimani writes that she too had wanted to emulate Bupasha, but like her, she succumbed to the daily grind of domestic chores. What Soleimani leaves unanswered is the assumption that in post-independence Algeria and Iran, regardless of women's participation in revolutionary struggles, they will be relegated to the domestic sphere, presumed to be walled off from the public and the political arena. A feminist critique of this logic, since Soleimani gestures to reading other feminist critiques, so I thought to myself, a feminist critique of this logic and expectation might have introduced Soleimani to Maida Yeunoglu's analysis of what women symbolized in the Algerian War of Independence. I quote her, "In the struggle over capturing or preserving the essence of the Algerian culture, women came to symbolize, both for the French and the Algerians, the embodiment of this essence. Hence, the struggle over this authentic essence was fought over women's bodies. It was onto her veiled body that both French colonialism and Algerian patriarchy projected their fears, desires, and policies." End of quote. This battle over women's bodies is brutally evident in the torture and rape of Bupasha by the French colonial authorities and in her transformation into a housewife in charge of children and the home, where presumably she would be the guardian of culture. As Yeunoglu further elaborates, Islam came to be seen as the fundamental difference between France and Algeria, uniting the secular and religious in their view of women's roles. I quote again, "Algerian nationalists were generally in favor of emancipation, but they also insisted that women in their traditionalist role had preserved the native traditions, being less polluted than men by French influence, and that what they wanted was a free Algerian woman, not a free French woman." End of quote. It's remarkable that in this binary opposition, Algerian men are exempted from any attempt at purifying themselves of those bad, awful influences. In the Iranian context, Nima Naqibi has similarly demonstrated how women have been caught in the binary opposition between Iran and the West. In her analysis of specifically Kate Mellett and two European feminists' visit to Iran in 1979, and the 5-minute audience they were granted with Ayatollah Khomeini in Rome, Naqibi reads Ayatollah Khomeini's silence and refusal to answer any questions as an indication of his, I quote, "stubborn taciturnity regarding his position on Iranian women." So it was I think the title of the essay is, original essay is 5 minutes of silence. He sat there in silence. As Naqibi points out, this in turn, I quote, allowed the ruling elite to argue that feminism was a Western phenomenon and that all feminist activity in Iran would be perceived as counter-revolutionary behavior. Iranian feminists were thus forced to choose between the two sides of a false binary, the West and Iran. If Soleimani is unaware of feminist critiques such as Yegunoglu's or Naghibi's, her knowledge of the Iranian Revolution is also very limited to the roles played by prominent men. This history, as Naghmeh Sohrabi cogently argues, does not consider the different kinds of work that are part of any revolutionary movement. Calling for a radical change in historiography of revolution, Sohrabi argues, I quote, "Writing revolution as if women matter requires us to shift our analytical framework away from revolution as intellectual work, primarily located in the imaginings of revolutionary strategists and theoreticians, to revolution as political work, primarily located in action and in the streets, and in doing so brings to the fore the kind of epistemological reckoning that expands what counts as revolutionary history and what counts as valid methods, sources, and interpretation." End of that quote. Soleimani, of course, can't be faulted for lack of access to the kind of expansive history and epistemological shift that Sohrabi longs for and is advocating for. But in her identification with Bupasha's transformation into a housewife, there's a tacit consent to a gender hierarchy that is absent from her descriptions of when she arrives in Tehran as a student. Soleimani's move to Tehran immediately introduces her to a transformed city. She said, "I arrived in Tehran with particular hopes and desires. Above all, I wanted to play the role of protesting student. This was the image I had in my mind: clenched fists, occasional sit-ins, heated arguments among students, hikes, and mounted climbing. What folly! A cold and quiet university opened its arched gateway to me." End of quote. Soleimani's image of a protesting student predates the success of the revolution. However, her sense of belatedness is countered by her realization that Tehran's transformation holds great promises for her. I quote, "In reality, Tehran was a city of opportunities. I had come empty-handed from the ends of the earth, and yet Tehran accepted me. Although sometimes I think I arrived in Tehran at the precise moment that in the wake of the revolution, the city, having undergone a political purification and overhaul of values, was receptive to new residents and was ready to nurture them according to the new interests and tastes. In truth, I was a resident of the Tehran of the Islamic Republic." End of quote. Her description of a nurturing and welcoming Tehran, of course, glosses over the bloodshed that followed the revolution. Appearances, she learns, including her own, can be subject to subjective interpretation and understanding, and can be situational. She says that she learned socialization in the dorm at the University of Tehran. And even more importantly, she says she became familiar with an Iran mu'annas, a feminine Iran, at the university. This femininity, which again she doesn't tell us in great detail about, is in sharp contrast to her own appearance upon her arrival in Tehran. I quote from Soleimani, "I had a particular look, a coarse, tanned villager clad in chador. My appearance announced from a great distance that I'd come from the provinces. I learned this later from my roommates who became friends. I moved my body like that of a female farmer who had no inkling of the delicate and feminine comportment, nor any understanding of the different modes of living. I understood the differences, but I did not find fault with my own way of being." End of quote. Soleimani's exposure to this feminine Iran is reflected in the description of a self that she now observes, of course, from the outside, through others' eyes. Her description of her work as a writer is similarly, I would argue, informed by seeing herself in light of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Soleimani's self-comparisons with Woolf could be seen as a deliberate attempt to highlight how 90 years after the publication of A Room of One's Own, women writers in Iran are deprived of basic needs to devote themselves to writing. In her essay, "من زنی پیش مدرنم," she first focuses on the conditions under which she grew up. Let me begin with the small room in the village. Don't be hasty. I know Virginia Woolf's sentence can be taken metaphorically. We'll get to that, she says. Of course, interestingly, she never returns to that. She writes instead, "I have provided this brief introduction to indicate that even though I do not have a room of my own, I have no regrets." Notwithstanding her claim to having no regrets, her description of a typical day in her life as a writer underscores that she is denied an intellectual space that would allow her to pursue ideas beyond even her fictional creations. She admits to waking up late and ridicules herself for having retained this habit as the only facet of the life of the individual, sleeping in. Upon waking, she immediately becomes immersed in concerns about what she should make for lunch. I quote, "I don't ponder the whys of the universe, nor do I think about mortality or anxieties that beset human beings, the suffering of the denizens of the third world, or women's rights. Quite simply, I ask myself, what should I make for lunch today?" End of quote. Having emphasized the urgent need to prepare lunch, Soleimani nonetheless pauses to question the significance of a woman's life. "I live in a third world country." Oh, we're going over time. Maybe I should wrap it up quickly. Yeah. "What do I make for lunch?" She says, "As a citizen, I live in a third world country. That's why my question becomes, what do I make for lunch? I eat my breakfast in a hurry. Why? Because soon it will be lunchtime and I have to prepare food for everyone. I myself do not matter. I have never mattered. My life does not have the same significance as others. Please consider whether a woman who has never lived for herself can be in search of a room, a thought, an idea, and a place of her own." These questions, of course, raise alarming concerns about how women can assume that they matter only insofar as they serve others. I'll just finish with the scene of her cooking. As Soleimani begins to prepare lunch, she starts with sautéing onions. She becomes so absorbed in writing a chapter of this novel she's finishing that she ends up burning the onions. So she has to resort to using the store-bought variety that make her feel guilty. The smell of onions juxtaposed with the unresponsive fictional characters she's struggling with gives way to a generalization, surprisingly, about women's writing in Iran. I quote, "So that is why today many refer to works written by women as kitchen stories. I am certain that if we have a sharp nose, we can catch a whiff of sautéed onions in many women's narratives. This is the inevitable fate of female Iranian writers, women who are not socially and economically independent. Can a woman who depends on a man's earnings, be it for daily food or other necessities, expect a room of her own?" As if responding to her own questions, she says, "Oh, well, no, I'm fine. I don't need it." She says, "I don't have a room of my own, and I don't need it. For in reality, we don't have the means to buy anything other than this small apartment." This constant shuttling between attestations of enjoying her work as a writer and lacking a space and financial independence, foreground a struggle to make peace with a woman's lot today in Iran. This struggle is also reflected in answers she provides in an interview about differences she perceives between literature produced in Iran and literature produced in the West. She says, for example, I have a body, but as a woman writer, what can I write about my body? Nothing. I have a sexual identity. How can I write about it? Impossible. I am faced with tyrannical relations that deny me equal rights, but what can I say about them? Nothing. End of quote. In the same interview, she highlights the supremacy of censorship. She comes to the topic of censorship again. And in a society where the doors are all closed and censorship reigns, how can novels be produced? This is an absolute impossibility. And of course, she publishes novels. She also states that before censors intervene in the work of the writers themselves engage in self-censorship. She also claims that fardiyat, or subjectivity, has no purchase in Persian worldview or language. She is more forthright in the interview than she is in a collection of essays. This is the critique that she offers of women. The reality is that we walk, women writers that is, the reality is that we walk in the footsteps of male writers and men's discourses. We think within structures of these discourses and produce our works within them. We replicate their cliches and do not transcend accepted constructs. We don't have a language of our own or unique themes of our own, nor do we have the courage to challenge the accepted norms or think independently. In some, we don't have a room of our own, nor do we feel the need for it. So the question that remains for me is that she gives us glimpses of a fiercely independent woman, young woman, who left her village for the first time. She, with 500 tomans that her father gave her, she found ways of finding work and surviving and getting her degree and staying in Tehran. Her story, I would say, despite her self-censorship and the many things that she leaves out, and despite her identification as a pre-modern woman, demonstrates that she is well aware of what forms of subjection prevent her and other Iranian women from realizing their full potential. The question that haunts Nam Kuchek Man Belqeys is, when will Soleimani act on her resolve, I quote from her, to state who I was and what I wanted to be. This self-knowledge, which she acquired by studying Shariati, has the potential to become fully embodied. Thank you.
Do you have time? Will you take some questions?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to pose one, sure. I know who you are, Professor Marmon, but if you could state who you are just for the audience and for the speakers.
Hi, I'm not standing up because this table is in the way. I'm Sean Marmon. I'm in the religion department, and I have an old connection to Near Eastern Studies. And I'm a great admirer of Professor Rahimieh's work, especially on film. But my question after that is, has Soleimani made any statement, or did she make any statement during Woman Life Freedom or after Woman Life Freedom?
She has. It's really, I follow her Instagram feed daily, because there too we see all these contradictions, because she just, I think 2 days ago, or on the anniversary of the Mahsa Amini's killing, she posted something about the suffering of the mothers who had lost children to the uprising. She has said in other places, for instance, one about the execution of some of the young Iranians. She has been vocal. But then during the attacks, during the 12-day war, she was much more sort of a proud nationalist Iranian that we must stand up to. So, there's that vacillation. But I think that she has this innate desire to support any effort to recognize women's rights to equality.
From what you said, she seems to be a master of ambiguity.
Yes, and this is why I said I struggled with this text, because I think that she probably has no choice but to use subterfuge. She's hardly in a position to say things openly. What I discovered is when I was translating a couple of her flash fiction pieces, she's very open to dialogue. And I have yet to discuss this with her, because I wonder how she would react. I think that she might be angry to some extent. But, the ambivalences are, yes, as you say, very, very prominent. She says things and then she pulls back.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. There's so much on my mind, which I'll save for later. But just for now, I had a couple of, one question. I guess a little bit of commentary here. In regards to reclaiming her name, the Belqeys, I will say that it's not a very familiar Persian name, so it is interesting. But I'm also thinking of it in terms of attending, especially lower level K through 12 schools in Iran. Mm-hmm. A lot of teachers will only call you by your last name. So there's also, which just felt militaristic. So outside of the intimacy of, which is real, because once you hit college especially, and it is a co-ed space, some people will preserve their last name as a means of keeping people out of their personal space. And if somebody wants to step into it, they'll say things because I had a very good friend whose name was Fazilat, and anytime she'd say her name to people, the people who wanted to get closer would be like, no, but what's your esme kuchiketche? So it's also an interesting thing for me to think about. Is that also a taking back that whole system in which she might have grown up in, where your first name was never acknowledged anyways, regardless of the class issues that you laid out as well. I thought that was interesting. My other question is just very straightforward in terms of who she's influenced. I began to think about that immediately as you started talking about her work. I started thinking about Zoya Pirzad or Shiva Arastui, or I'm just curious if there is a lineage that you trace out words from her, because despite all the ways that she voiced her discontents, at the same time, we can say that this has become a very popular form in which women are doing fantastic work in Iran. So thank you again.
Thank you. Definitely, I think that it is part of, she's very much aware of, I think it's maybe that she's much more of a reader of everything that's published by women. So I would not be surprised that, in fact, she sometimes mentions the women writers. She mentions Zoya Pirzad and others. I think for her, it has been a journey of discovery as well. I don't know that she has, were you saying if she has influenced others?
She's kind of aware of the way you were placing her in this trajectory of women writers in Iran, who's revolutionary, and the ways that I think a lot of them do have to tackle this idea of feeling pre-modern.
Right.
And they do that in their writing in these brilliant ways.
That's right. Well, I mean, think of Zoya Pirzad's Adat Mikonim, we're just, making do. Yes, I think she is aware of that. She doesn't talk about it that I have found openly. I mean, these personal essays are really the first things that I've read that are tackle issues that are important to her, aside from her Instagram posts that sometimes drive me bananas. But anyway, yeah, I think she's very much aware of that. I would love to have a conversation with her. I don't know to what extent that conversation will be candid about this trajectory, that sort of historiography of women's writing. Because I'm genuinely, obviously I'm not in agreement with her about what she says, we just follow men writers. Because I mean, she writes about things and other women are writing about things that were never written about. And no man had ever in Iran written about. But there's something there that she is advancing, and I think that is part of I mean, if she lived in a different environment, maybe there would be much more of a programmatic statement that she would make about, this is where we are in the history of modern women's writing. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate your comment about the use of first names or not use of first names.
Sure. Thank you so much. It was an amazing talk. Thank you. I have a question about, in terms of the format or the brevity of her essays and Dastanak and these short stories. And it's a question of, is it that the brevity is a kind of imposed restriction by the domesticity of her life, or is that kind of a stylistic adaptation? Because she's not the only Dastanak writer, but...
Yeah. I've often wondered this myself. Because I don't live in Iran and I'm far away, I feel like I don't have a palpable sense of how Dastanaks have become so popular in Iran. And there are so many more women writers, well, perhaps men too, but I follow mostly, that write in this flash fiction. Sometimes when I'm reading Belqeys Soleimani or others' flash fiction, I feel like, oh, that's so much easier. Because you don't have to get into the more complex issues. And it's very hard to write about the realities of everyday life if you're writing realist fiction. Well, even if you're not writing realist fiction, to leave those complexities. So I think that there's perhaps something to be, this is not scientific, but I think there's something true about how the genre itself makes it possible to circumvent some of those issues of censorship. And by the way, she writes, I mean, one of her novels that I read not too long ago really had a shocking ending. And I felt like, okay, so where's the critique of these things? I'd love to read how she's being reviewed. I wish I had more contact, my immediate contact in Iran. But I think the genre itself, maybe there's something to be, there is an analysis that somebody should do, the Dastanak in our literary history. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. So in your discussion, you mentioned that in the post-revolutionary Iran, the feminist discourse is always tied to Western influence, forcing women to navigate a difficult choice between nationalist commitments and feminist aspirations. So because I am doing research on the contemporary issues, so I would like to ask for your opinion about how do we rethink about this, and is there a space in current Iran to conceptualize an indigenous feminism or feminist movement that can be avoid of being subsumed under Western influence? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great. Do you want to also?
No, just a question.
Just a question.
I'll come later.
Yeah. And there are many feminists. I started last year. I started this project, which hasn't gotten very far because of my illness and so on, my operations. But with a postdoctoral fellow working on a history, a kind of an oral history of Iranian women's movement. So we started with interviews with, it was easier to interview feminists who have left Iran. For instance, people who were very much involved in the 1 million signature campaign, that entire approach to grassroots consciousness raising, both for women and men in society. There are indeed, I would say there are a lot of. What I was referring to is about this dichotomy that is, by the way, it's a false dichotomy. It's imposed from the outside. And I find that really dominant in the Western discourse about it. But as Nasrin Rahimieh was saying, that's what forced women at that moment in the revolution, right after the revolution, to have to go, oh, I can't be a traitor to my country, and I can't be. It's not true. There have been, in fact, I'm thinking now of someone like pioneers of Iranian women's movement, like Elisa Nasarian and others. They've written about so many, or Parvin Paidar and others. There have been a lot of feminists, indigenous. And, it kind of, I would say, well, I call it grassroots, that I found in a couple of those interviews that I did, I found very exciting. And so feminism doesn't need to be a question that comes from the West.
Reza, we'll have to be the last questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. So I'm basically just echoing on that. I was thinking when she comes from Kerman and then, later in Tehran, and then, talk about, for example, Jamila Bupasha or, Shariati. I was just wondering, whether she's also thinking about the literature was already, in Iran, much before, for example, about the ladies or the women, writing, having poets, for example, Makhfi, or, so many, Rabia, because on the other side, in Afghanistan, for example, when our women, usually write, they immediately go to that. So that reflects, is this the same situation in this case, you can say?
Thank you. You put your finger on something very important, because while I was describing the kind of very modest circumstances she grew up in, she was not deprived of a literary education. And what is really amazing and made me feel badly about my own upbringing in Iran is that they didn't have electricity, so they had kind of like a hurricane lamp, And at night, her father, who had only had enough education in the maktab, he would recite from the Shahnameh. So before they even went to school, they 8 children, they had learned to memorize poetry, and they became familiar with a classical tradition. So she says, for instance, she knew by heart much of Hafiz, Sadi, you name it, and she actually, when it comes to the older tradition, she's definitely well informed. Yes. And I think that were she able to, or if she wanted to write that history, I think she would have a lot more to offer.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking you.